Addiction doesn't always come in needles, bottles, or pills. Sometimes it comes in the form of perfectionism, constant busyness, emotional chaos, people-pleasing, endlessly scrolling, endlessly consuming, endlessly avoiding. So ask yourself, what are you chasing that keeps running from you? What silence do you dread so much that you'd rather numb than listen? What part of your life feels normal but leaves you hollow when the high wears off? Jung didn't see addiction as mere weakness. He saw it as a substitute for transcendence, a desperate reach for the sacred, misdirected through compulsive repetition. You return to the thing that hurts you because for a moment it feels like home, like control, like relief. But that relief is borrowed, and the debt always comes due. So why do you keep paying? What if the substance, the cycle, the obsession was never the real craving? What if the real ache was for yourself, the one you left behind when life asked you to be smaller, quieter, more acceptable? You don't need to fight your addiction. You need to understand what it protects. Because the moment you see the pattern, you can break the spell. And the part of you that's still awake, still watching, already knows this isn't who you are, not anymore. You weren't born addicted, you were born whole, but the world didn't know how to hold that wholeness, so it split you, told you to hide your rage, to bury your need, to swallow your grief. And what wasn't welcomed into the light, you fed in the dark. Addiction begins where connection is lost, not just to others, but to your own self. So ask yourself, when did you stop believing that your pain deserved presence? When did escape feel safer than staying? When did silence become unbearable unless something was playing, buzzing, numbing in the background? Jung didn't view addiction as a failure of will. He saw it as a fragmentation of soul, a cry from the unconscious begging for return, not just to sobriety but to selfhood. Because every compulsion is a message, every loop is a symbol, every craving is a code. And your job is to interpret it, not punish it. Because what you think is addiction is actually adaptation. You learn to soothe the unbearable in the only ways available. You learn to survive emotional abandonment by self-abandoning faster. You built a life that looked functional but felt hollow. And then you filled that hollow with rituals that kept you from remembering. Remembering what? That you are still in there. That what you long for is not a fix, but a return to safety, to inner authority, to a kind of grounded aliveness that doesn't depend on stimulation, validation, or sedation. So ask again, what am I avoiding by chasing? What am I anesthetizing by performing? What version of me is waiting beneath this cycle, not to be punished, but to be met? You don't need more shame. You need to come home. And Jung's work wasn't about willpower. It was about wholeness. Addiction wins when you exile your truth. It ends the moment you reclaim it. Addiction is not just a habit. It is a symbolic cry from the unconscious, a ritual of avoidance masking itself as relief. Jung never saw the addict as weak. He saw them as divided, possessed by an unmet need, trapped in a loop of compensation, crying out for a wholeness they were never taught to hold. To Jung, addiction is not the problem, it is the symptom. So ask yourself, what is this craving pointing to? What am I seeking through this cycle that I no longer believe I can receive directly? What emotion, if fully felt, would undo the entire scaffolding of this addiction? 1. The shadow addiction as a split-off self. At the root of your addiction is not weakness, but disintegration. Jung called this the shadow, the parts of you you've exiled in order to survive. The rage you weren't allowed to feel, the grief no one held space for. The desire that was labeled shameful. Each time you denied these parts, they didn't disappear. They went underground. And down there in the dark, they began to form rituals, loops, obsessions, addictions. Not to destroy you, but to get your attention. Because what you reject in consciousness, you will meet in compulsion. So ask, what part of me did I have to silence in order to be accepted? What feeling was so taboo I'd rather numb than feel it? What pain was never mirrored and now returns as craving? You're not just addicted, you're exiled from your own aliveness. 2. The complex. When the wound becomes the god. Jung spoke of complexes as autonomous psychic fragments, clusters of memory, emotion, belief, and trauma that act like separate personalities within the psyche. When you're in an addiction cycle, you're not failing, you're possessed. You become the child again, desperate for soothing. You become the orphan reaching for anything that feels like connection. You become the performer, hoping this time, this fix, this person will finally fill the void. But it never lasts. Why? Because the complex doesn't want healing. It wants repetition. It wants reenactment. It wants the same cycle, because the cycle is its identity. So ask, who do I become when the addiction takes over? What story keeps replaying in my rituals? What identity am I keeping alive through my suffering? Until you see the complex and name it, you will keep mistaking it for yourself. 3. The God image, misplaced transcendence. Jung believed every addiction is a substitute for the sacred. You don't just want relief. You want union with peace, with purpose, with something beyond the noise of this world. But when the true path to transcendence is blocked, when soul is dismissed, when meaning is absent, when ritual is missing, the psyche finds a counterfeit. The bottle becomes your church. The high becomes your communion. The scroll becomes your prayer. And in that space, the sacred is distorted, not because you are broken, but because you are desperate. Ask, what ritual have I built around my addiction? What sacred function is my craving attempting to fulfill? What deeper hunger lives beneath this surface satisfaction? You're not weak for reaching, but what you're reaching for can't be bought, consumed, or chased. It must be reclaimed. 4. The persona, addiction as escape from the mask. You've built a life that looks fine, maybe even impressive, but it's not real, not deep down. Jung called this your persona, the mask you wear to survive the social world. And the more you over-identify with the mask, the more unbearable it becomes to sit with your real self, the one that's tired, afraid, messy, confused. So what do? You scroll, you binge, you escape. Not because you're out of control, but because you've lost touch with what's real. Addiction wins when your truth is buried under performance. Ask, what mask do I keep performing? Who do I become when I'm on? Who am I when no one's watching? And why do I run from that version of me? Because underneath your persona is not failure, it's freedom. 5. The transcendent function, from split to synthesis. In Jungian psychology, healing addiction doesn't mean erasing it. It means listening to it, sitting with the craving, not to resist it, but to understand it. To speak to the shadow, the complex, the God image, the persona, and invite them into dialogue. This is the transcendent function, the psychological alchemy that happens when you allow opposing parts to meet without judgment. The addict and the seeker, the shadow and the soul, the craving and the calling. You don't have to choose between them, you have to hold them, long enough, gently enough, courageously enough, until something new emerges, not a fix, but a fusion, a third way. A self that's more than symptom, more than shame, more than survival. Ask, what if my addiction is not the enemy, but the messenger? What if I stopped trying to kill the craving and learned how to speak to it? What would healing look like if it was integration, not elimination? Because you cannot shame your way into wholeness. You can only love your way there. Final reflection. The symbol beneath the substance. Jung didn't offer easy answers. He didn't give you 5 steps to quit. He gave you a mirror. And in that mirror, you must look not just at the behavior, but at the symbol. Because your addiction is symbolic. It's trying to show you something you haven't been willing to feel. It's asking you to remember what you've forgotten. That discipline is not punishment, it's devotion. That stillness is not death, it's a doorway. That craving is not weakness, it's the map back to the part of you that was never meant to be exiled in the first place. So ask one last time, what is this addiction protecting? What would I have to feel to finally be free? Because the goal is not sobriety, it's sovereignty. And that begins the moment you stop running from yourself and start walking toward it. You already know the stereotype, the drunk on the street corner, the junkie in a dark alley, the gambler losing it all. But that's not the whole truth. That's the mask society gives addiction so it can distance itself from its own reflection. Jung would ask you to look deeper, because addiction wears many faces, and you might be wearing one right now. Ask yourself, what do I need just to feel okay? What do I reach for when I don't want to feel? What would fall apart if I stopped chasing that next hit of anything? Because addiction isn't always dramatic. It's often subtle, socially rewarded, even spiritualized. And that's what makes it dangerous and invisible. 1. The performer addicted to achievement. You wake up with a list. You go to bed with guilt. You track, optimize, execute. And yet it's never enough. Not because your goals are wrong, but because you're not the one who set them. Your inner child did. The one who thought, if I succeed, maybe they'll love me. If I excel, maybe I'll belong. So you keep performing, addicted to accomplishment. You call it drive, but it's not purpose, it's compulsion. You fear rest because silence reveals the shadow. You fear stillness because it confronts you with the truth. You don't know who you are without the doing. Ask, what do I believe I'll lose if I slow down? What version of success am I addicted to? Who am I when I'm not producing? Because the performer isn't bad, they're just tired. Tired of running from the feeling that worth must be earned. 2. The escapist, addicted to avoidance. You're not chasing highs, you're fleeing the lows. The text message never answered. The silence in the room. The childhood wound still bleeding in the background of your day. So you numb. Through wine, weed, TV, sex, food, dopamine hits on demand. It works, until it doesn't. And when it wears off, the ache returns, more hollow, more haunting. You tell yourself, just one more scroll, just one more episode, just one more drink. But underneath that one more is the truth you don't want to feel. Ask, what am I trying not to remember? What memory still stings too much to name? What silence do I avoid at all costs? Because the escapist is not weak, they are grieving. And no substance can outpace sorrow that has never been witnessed. 3. The healer, addicted to self-improvement. You read all the books. You journal, meditate, do shadow work, inner child work, manifestation, fasting, cold plunges. You're always healing, but somehow never healed. Because healing has become your drug. It gives you a purpose. It keeps you focused. It distracts you from the unbearable truth you still feel unworthy underneath it all. So you keep chasing breakthroughs. You keep trying to become a better version of you without ever accepting the one who's already here. Ask, what would happen if I stopped fixing myself? Who would I be without the next goal method or mentor? What if my growth is now a form of self-abandonment? Because the healer is noble, but healing without integration becomes another way to delay embodiment. And at some point, you must stop seeking and start living. 4. The romantic, addicted to intensity. You crave love that shakes the ground, relationships that burn, ache, consume. You mistake chaos for connection. You equate emotional turbulence with depth. You confuse anxiety with chemistry. And when things calm down, you feel bored, or worse, invisible. So you seek another flame. You say, I just feel things deeply. But deep feeling without rootedness becomes obsession. You're not in love, you're addicted to the feeling of being seen. Ask, why does peace feel like abandonment? What does normal love feel like to my nervous system? Am I mistaking re-traumatization for romance? Because the romantic doesn't want love. They want recognition from the past through the present. Until that's healed, every partner will be a proxy. 5. The martyr addicted to suffering. You always give. You hold space for others. You sacrifice your needs, your time, your energy in the name of love, loyalty, or duty. But beneath the surface is resentment. You feel empty, exhausted, unseen. And still, you can't stop. Because if you stop giving, who are you? If you ask for something, will you be too much? If you receive, will it feel safe? So you suffer. Quietly, repeatedly, proudly. Ask, what do I gain from my pain? What identity am I preserving through exhaustion? What am I afraid will happen if I let someone care for me? Because the martyr doesn't want to be a hero. They want to be held. Final reflection. You've been here before. Maybe you saw yourself in one of these. Maybe in all. That's not failure. That's awareness. You've tried everything: performance, escape, healing, romance, martyrdom, and none of it brought you back to yourself. Because addiction is not just about the substance, it's about the substitute. You're substituting ritual for reverence, stimulation for stillness, approval for belonging, chasing the external because the internal was never safe. So ask, which version of addiction do I spiritualize? What cycle do I call normal that's actually draining me? What truth do I silence every time I reach for that familiar comfort? You don't need to shame these patterns, you need to name them. Because the moment you do, they begin to loosen. And beneath every addiction is not destruction, but a self waiting to be met. Not punished, not fixed, just finally seen. Addiction is not random. It is not moral failure. It is not weakness. It is structure, unconscious, sacred, terrifying structure. And until you learn to see it as a system, your psyche built to survive, you will keep fighting shadows instead of liberating the self trapped beneath them. Ask yourself, what problem is my addiction solving? What pain is it protecting me from? What part of me would unravel if I stopped repeating this cycle? Because until you answer those questions, the pattern will persist, not because you want it, but because a deeper part of you believes you need it. 1. Possession by archetype, when addiction becomes identity. Jung warned about psychic possession when a person is overtaken by an archetype so fully they cease to be an individual. They become the addict. Not someone struggling with addiction, but someone defined by it. You start speaking from it, acting from it, justifying from it. Every conversation becomes a justification, a deflection, a performance. You say things like, I can stop whenever I want. This is just how I cope. It's not that bad. But those aren't your words. They belong to the archetype that has taken the wheel, the wounded inner child, the rejected shadow, the persona that performs wellness while secretly unraveling. Ask, when did my addiction stop being a behavior and start being my identity? What role am I playing that protects me from being fully seen? What would happen if I stepped out of the archetype and back into myself? Because the longer you stay possessed, the less you remember you are not your compulsion. You are the consciousness underneath it, watching, waiting, aching to return. 2. Reward versus ritual, when numbing replaces meaning. Dopamine is real. Feedback loops are real. Your brain is wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But what you call reward is often compensation for what your life lacks in ritual. You eat not because you're hungry, but because no one taught you how to grieve. You scroll not because you're lazy, but because you've lost contact with wonder. You drink not because you don't care, but because your days lack beauty, connection, meaning. So you numb. You try to fill the hole with sugar, sex, caffeine, chaos, anything to feel something, anything to avoid the ache of emptiness. But the truth is, the hole was never chemical. It was spiritual. Ask, where have I lost contact with sacred rhythm? What routines have I abandoned that once rooted me? What would it mean to replace indulgence with intentionality? Because addiction thrives where ritual has died. And recovery is not just abstinence, it is the resurrection of what was once holy. 3. Emotional substitution. When feelings become too dangerous to hold. Every time you reach for your addiction, you're trying to feel less of something. Grief, shame, fear, rage. But you're also trying to feel more of something. Peace, control, love, aliveness. Addiction becomes your only reliable emotional regulator. Instead of feeling your sadness, you binge. Instead of naming your anger, you scroll. Instead of holding your anxiety, you light up, pour another, chase a hit. You've learned that your nervous system can't hold what's real, so you bypass it. But the emotions never die. They pile up, unprocessed, underground. And over time, they create the very overwhelm you fear. Ask, what feeling terrifies me most? What would happen if I let myself cry fully? What have I never said out loud, even to myself? Because you don't need to eliminate emotion. You need to expand your capacity to hold it without outsourcing it to a substance or a screen. 4. Fear of power. When sobriety means facing your life. Let's be honest, part of you knows that quitting would work. That if you stopped drinking, scrolling, self-sabotaging, you might actually rise. You might finish the book, repair the relationship, start the business, face your truth. And that is terrifying, because if you succeed, you lose the excuse. You lose the story that says, I could have, but you lose the identity of the almost healed, almost there, always struggling seeker. And then what? You'd have to be seen, held accountable, present. Ask, what becomes possible if I recover? What becomes impossible if I keep numbing? What truth would I have to live if I had no more ways to hide? Because addiction is not just escape, it's protection from power. It lets you play small while pretending to be working on yourself. And that illusion is harder to give up than the substance itself. 5. The addict complex. When the cycle becomes self-fulfilling. In Jungian terms, a complex is an autonomous psychic structure, a cluster of energy, memory, emotion, and belief. It has a life of its own. It hijacks your behavior, then punishes you for it. The addict complex whispers, "You're going to mess this up anyway. No one will understand you. You've always been like this." And so you act accordingly and then shame yourself. You relapse, then spiral. You promise change, then sabotage it. You internalize the voice of failure until it sounds like your own. But that voice is not you. It's a wound repeating itself. And it breaks the moment you interrupt it. Ask, whose voice is this really? Who first made me feel like I wasn't worth saving? What happens if I stop believing this narrative? Because healing isn't about conquering the complex, it's about refusing to confuse it with your truth. Final reflection. What you call addiction is a map. You've blamed yourself for too long. But what if this isn't punishment? What if it's a portal? A cracked doorway through which your lost self is calling? Not to shame you, but to summon you. Ask, what longing hides beneath my craving? What would sobriety actually make space for, not just remove? What version of me has been waiting, not to be fixed, but to be met? Because Jung wouldn't tell you to be stronger. He'd ask you to be more whole. And wholeness begins the moment you stop numbing and start listening, not to your addiction, but to the self that addiction tried to silence. Recovery is not a task. It is a relationship with yourself, your pain, your past, and your potential. And like any sacred relationship, it asks not for perfection, but presence. It demands not performance, but participation. So if you want to stop letting addiction win, you must stop treating it like an enemy and begin treating it like a teacher. Ask, what if this craving is calling me towards something, not just away? What would it mean to build a life so meaningful I no longer need to escape it? Where in my daily routine am I still outsourcing my peace? Because the goal isn't just to quit, it's to create a new way of living, one that doesn't require anesthesia to endure. Shadow work. Let the cravings speak. Instead of resisting your addictive urge, turn toward it. Write it a letter. Ask, what are you protecting me from? What do you want me to feel instead? Don't moralize it, don't sanitize it. Let it speak with raw honesty. You'll find that beneath the craving is something sacred, a message from the part of you that was exiled too long. Maybe it's grief, maybe it's rage, maybe it's the 9-year-old version of you still waiting to be held. And when that voice is heard, really heard, the compulsion begins to loosen. Ask, what do I avoid feeling when I reach for my addiction? What younger version of me shows up in the moment of relapse? What would it mean to witness that part instead of silencing it? Because recovery isn't about force, it's about compassion. Deep, daily, radical compassion for the one inside who never learned how to stay. 2. Sacred structure, replace compulsion with ritual. Jung taught that the unconscious is structured like a language, and ritual is the grammar through which you speak to it. So create sacred rhythms to replace addictive loops. Not punishment, not productivity, ritual. Wake with stillness. Breathe before checking your phone. Walk instead of numbing. Light a candle instead of lighting a cigarette. Touch the earth. Drink water like it's holy. Write before you reach. Every act of discipline becomes a spell cast not to control you, but to summon the self you long to become. Ask, what rituals calm my nervous system without causing harm? What routines feel like home, not performance? What's one daily anchor I can create to stay in relationship with my truth? Because addiction thrives in chaos, but ritual roots you in meaning, and meaning is stronger than willpower. 3. Cultivate inner dialogue. Let the self lead you. You've heard the voice of the addict, the voice of the critic, the voice of the child. But what about the self, the wise one, the witness, the part of you that's never been addicted, only waiting? This self doesn't scream, it doesn't shame, it waits, observes, offers clarity when you're ready to listen. Begin developing a dialogue with it. Speak aloud in your car. Write to it in your journal. Ask it for guidance when you want to numb. And slowly, day by day, that voice grows louder, stronger, more trustworthy. Not because it controls you, but because it remembers you. Ask, what would my higher self say about this choice? How would my healed self handle this moment? What truth have I been pretending not to know? Because recovery isn't about deleting voices, it's about choosing which one you let lead. 4. Rewire relationships, choose mirrors that reflect truth. Many people relapse because their environments are built on performance, not presence. You hang out with people who laugh at your growth, who mock your boundaries, who need you to stay small so they don't have to grow. But addiction cannot heal in isolation, and it cannot heal in distortion. So look around. Do your relationships reflect your wholeness or your wound? Do they support your sobriety or sabotage it through subtle seduction? Begin curating a circle that honors your truth. Seek out those who see your light, not just your loyalty. Find mirrors who remind you who you actually are. Ask, who benefits from my self-abandonment? Who challenges me to be more, not less? What would happen if I surrounded myself with people I couldn't lie to? Because healing isn't just individual. It's relational, and your nervous system knows the difference. 5. Build systems of repair, not perfection. You will relapse, You will forget. You will fall asleep to your truth. That's not failure, that's being human. But instead of spiraling into shame, build a structure of repair, a way back, a path home. Maybe it's a ritual of recommitment, a cup of tea, a breath, a prayer. Maybe it's a journal prompt. What am I avoiding right now? Maybe it's a phone call, a walk, a cold shower, a boundary. You don't need to be flawless. You need to be faithful to your return. Ask, what can I build today that helps me begin again tomorrow? How can I make it easier to come back instead of punishing myself for leaving? What's one practice that reminds me I'm still worthy, even when I fall? Because discipline without repair is cruelty. But with repair, it becomes devotion. Final reflection. Sobriety is the side effect, not the goal. You're not here to white-knuckle your way through life. You're here to become someone you can trust. Someone who feels more alive without the drug, more grounded without the chaos, more nourished by presence than by performance. Addiction won't end because you finally try hard enough. It will end when you stop betraying the self it tried to replace. Ask, what am I really seeking in this moment? What kind of life would make addiction unnecessary? What would it feel like to want peace and finally believe I deserve it? Because you do, and not someday now, not when you're perfect, but when you're present, when you're willing to meet yourself in the ache, not to escape it, but to be transformed by it, because that is recovery, and it begins the moment you choose reverence over repetition. You've tried to fight it. You've tried to outrun it. You've tried to fix, manage, numb, or explain it away. But what if addiction isn't something to defeat, only something to outgrow? Carl Jung never said, be stronger. He said, be whole. He said, bring what is unconscious into the light. And you can't do that by willpower alone. You do it by turning inward, by reclaiming what you exiled, by choosing to see the part of you that's been waiting not to be punished, but to be welcomed home. Ask, what version of me have I postponed in the name of survival? What if I no longer needed to suffer to feel alive? What would my life become if peace was no longer terrifying? Because the truth is, addiction doesn't steal your power. It reveals it by showing you exactly where you left it behind. The craving is not a curse. It's a compass. It's pointing you to the place where you stopped trusting yourself. Where you made the deal, I'll numb this truth just to feel safe a little longer. But now, you don't need safety at the cost of your soul. You need sovereignty. You need structure that nourishes, not punishes. You need ritual, not repetition. You need to become someone whose presence no longer needs escape. So ask one last time, what would it look like to build a life I don't need to recover from? Who would I become if I stopped breaking the promise I made to myself? And am I willing right now to begin? Because the only thing addiction fears is your return. Return then, not with force, but with reverence. Not to who you were, but to who you were always meant to be.